This week we're joined by Peter Mayers, independent writer, researcher and author of No Place Like Home, Repairing Australia's Housing Crisis. In this episode we explore why Australia's housing system is fundamentally broken and what meaningful reform might actually look like. Peter shares compelling insights into the politics of supply versus demand, challenges assumptions about affordability and offers a framework about how we might reimagine housing as infrastructure, not just investment. We will be having a thoughtful, myth-busting discussion, and for anyone who's trying to grapple with this state of Australian housing, I think you're going to enjoy this episode.
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
Hi, I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, currently ranked number 3 in the MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, everything we talk about today is not personal advice, and we recommend you engage the services of a licensed and experienced professional.
Our guest today is Peter Mayers. Peter writes about housing and other public policy issues for Inside Story magazine and other media outlets. He's an adjunct senior research fellow at Monash University's School of Media, Film and Journalism. How the hell did you get to the property space? But anyway, we'll get into that. And now a fellow at the Centre for Policy Development. Previously, Peter spent 25 years as a broadcaster with the ABC. We are looking forward to Peter's unique blend of media insight and policy depth today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Veronica, thanks very much for having me on.
Peter, you're probably the most well-prepared guest we've ever had in almost 7-8 years we've been doing this. And there's so much we want to cover today. So thank you for your time. You actually gave us a little bit of some little cheat tips, to be honest. One of your little comments on there did catch my eye. You said, Australia's in a housing crisis, and it depends who you ask. And I think that's a really good place to start because it's not so black and white, right?
Yeah, look, thanks, Chris. I hope I'm not going to let you down on the day after all my preparation for this conversation. But yes, look, we often talk about crisis. We throw that word around a lot. It's a housing crisis. And it certainly is a housing crisis for some people. And I would say the epicenter of that crisis is amongst low-income earners in the private rental market, who are often paying more than half their income, half their disposable income, on rent, which leaves not enough money for health, out-of-pocket health costs, for transport, for getting the car fixed if you blow a tyre, all the kind of everyday expenses that come up, and a lot of those households with kids, of course, too. So that's the crisis side of it. But a crisis for some is a bonanza for others. So when we see property prices go up, what we're seeing is those people who are already in the market doing very well, and those people who don't own their own property being pushed. That barrier to entry is getting even higher. So, there's two sides always. It's a crisis on the one hand, and it's a bonanza on the other. And you see this in the media reporting. On the one hand, you'll have a story on. Well, it used to be on page 1 or whatever, but you'll have one story on the website which will be talking about someone who's been rendered homelessness and how terrible it is, and then later on or somewhere else in the paper there'll be record auction results on the weekend and how fantastic this is. And we, as if these two things aren't related to one another, but of course they are.
And we do have this, it's hypocrisy. It's almost schizophrenic in a way. It's like these things coexist, but we seem to ignore the other when we're talking about one of them. You've actually argued that...
That's true, Veronica, and we switch sides, right? So if we're trying to get into the housing market, we're just hoping house prices will come down a bit. And once we've bought, we're hoping they'll go up.
Yeah, exactly right. Now, you've actually argued that home ownership should not be the ultimate goal of housing policy. But, this is a country that treats it, owning your own home almost as a rite of passage. So why do you have that view, I guess, because it's quite a provocative one?
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say the ultimate goal of housing policy should be for everyone to have decent housing they can afford. And whether they own it or they rent, it doesn't really matter. It's about housing and being able to know that, you'll be there this week and you can be there next week. You're not going to be forced out by a sudden rent rise or whatever. But our focus, the Australian policy focus, is very much on home ownership as kind of the pinnacle. And there are reasons people want to own their own home. I get it, right? I own my own home, so and I know, that people want that because of the security it offers. But part of the reason is because renting is so bad in Australia for so many people, particularly if you're on a low income. So I guess I'm not opposed to home ownership. I'm not putting it that way, but privileging home ownership over everything else. And, we talk about, Australia's a nation of homeowners and it's in our culture. But if you go back to just the middle of last century, so up to the 1950s, we weren't a nation of homeowners at all. Half of the population rented. The home ownership thing is a relatively new phenomenon, and it was a deliberate policy by the Menzies government. Because Menzies, there was a communist threat at the time, and Menzies thought if people owned their own homes, they're going to be little capitalists and they were more likely to vote Liberal, indeed.
Well, it sort of worked for a long time, didn't it? But, you've also written about the financialisation of housing. And that's something that's talked about a lot, particularly since another Liberal government, obviously the Howard government, changed I'm not going to say negative gearing rules so much as the capital gains tax. Arrangements, back in 99. Can you explain, I guess, how you see that this trend has distorted our housing system and why policymakers have been so reluctant to push back against it?
Yeah. So look, it's and I try and avoid this term financialisation. It's a kind of a buzzword term. People talk about the financialisation of housing, and I think, well, what does that actually mean? But if we unpack it a bit, it's a whole set of actions over time that have happened. One is the deregulation of finance. So, we had much stricter mortgage controls back in the day than we do now. So opening up much higher levels of borrowing and then leveraging your own home to buy more properties. So, using the home as an asset against which you borrow in order to make further investments. So turning housing into an asset class rather than primarily seeing housing as as something that meets a fundamental need that gives you a home to live in safely and securely and affordably. So the particular, I guess we've got the two big tax things we know about. One is negative gearing. That enables someone who invests in property then to deduct any losses against their other income, which is a fairly unusual arrangement. You could understand, you'd say, you can deduct losses against your other rental income, but you can deduct it against your other investment income, but you can deduct it against your salary as an anaesthetist or, whatever it might be. So that's a fairly generous arrangement in Australia. And then we have the capital gains tax discount. And this is, I think, an even bigger factor. So that came in 2000, Howard Costello time. And if you read the reasoning back then, the reasoning made sense, right? What they wanted to do was encourage investment. So capital gain means you buy something, a house, or it could be a business or whatever, and then after a certain amount of time you sell it for more money, and the difference is your capital gain, your profit, if you like. And the idea was, well, if we reduce the tax on that, then we'll encourage more investment, more productive investment.
Wasn't it sort of tied into inflation, though? Because they were previously giving you an offset for inflation, so it was simplifying it.
That's right. That's the other side of it. It was simplifying. Instead of having to calculate what the effect of inflation had been over the last 7 years or 13 years or whatever, you just said, well, just give you a flat discount of 50%, half. And after 1 year, now that's a very short amount of time. If you're trying to counter inflation, why 1 year? Why not stagger it? Why not say, okay, you get a 10% discount after 1 year, a bit more after 2, and you encourage long-term investment. So what we saw with this capital gains tax discount wasn't a massive productive investment. It was a massive investment in housing. And you've all seen, everyone's probably seen, everyone listening to this podcast has seen those charts, those graphs put out by Grattan Institute and countless others that show, from 2000 to now, wages have gone up X amount and house prices have gone up X plus a lot.
Yes.
And that, so there's an argument that the difference is that capital gains tax change. And so, it's I think it is it encourages us to treat housing, as I say, as an asset class, and encourages speculation, if you like. And I think that's and it's, it doesn't matter whether you're buying a new house or an old house. So the other thing you could argue is that, okay, negative gearing, why don't we make it only for new properties so that we're actually building supply? If supply is such a big issue as we're constantly told it is, well, create the incentives for new properties, encourage supply rather than having it across the board. But you start getting into complications about different asset classes and so on when you do that.
Peter, I mean, we know we're doing this podcast, we're always learning there's new facets to the Australian property market that we haven't thought about, and it's a highly complex system, right? It's 11 million properties, and it's owned all across 25 million Australians, and it's people moving in, and there's so many issues. But in your mind, what are some of the big things that you think that are really just not doing us any favors here? I mean, you've just mentioned capital gains tax and negative gearing, but what are the other things that you think that are really problems that just we're not dealing with, and we just keep kicking it down the road, which is just making the problem worse and worse?
Yeah, well, look, let me make another point about the capital gains tax. So, for example, in Germany, they have a capital gains tax discount, but it only kicks in after 10 years. And if you did it that way around, you'd be encouraging someone to say, okay, I'm going to invest in housing, but what I really need is a secure tenant for 10 years. And maybe there'll be some capital gain at the end, but I'm not there for the capital gain. I'm really looking at the rental income. So our rental market needs to be focused on rental income as a source of revenue rather than capital gain. And, I welcome the
But then
shift
we want
to
more.
well, yeah.
We
and
want
also,
to put rents up then.
but I welcome the growth of the build to rent market. It's adding supply. It's at the top end mostly, but it is a new source, and those investors are looking for a steady stream of rental income rather than a capital gain. And I think we need more of that, if you like. So I think that's a good thing. But Chris, you asked me about the big problems. I guess, I would say the biggest problem, and I'm sure others have said this on your podcast, is that government, since about the mid-'80s and particularly the mid-'90s, stopped building social housing. Even if we go back to 2001, 5% of all housing was social housing. And when I say social housing, what do I mean? I mean, could be public housing, could be community housing, but it means that those people who live there on a low income are paying 30% or less of their income so they can afford that housing. That's the ideal. So 2000, we had 5%, which is a very small number in social housing. 2021, it was 4%, and it's been going down steadily. Now, if government had even kept it at 5%, we would have had 120,000 more houses in those 20 years. Not enough, but it would have been, a significant difference. When you think about the Housing Australia Future Fund is going to build, 30,000 social and affordable housing. So if we had 120,000 more, if we just kept up a steadier stream of investment, and we've done it in the past, we did it in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, Australia built an awful lot of housing. And if we look around the world at where housing is done well, and by done well, I mean, you don't have a lot of homelessness. You don't have you have people relatively well housed. They tend to be countries where government plays a relatively large role in the housing market by building housing and supplying housing, or by creating structures for community organisations or collectives or whatever it may be for non-market housing.
Peter, is that sort of the challenge though to fix that, right? So say build more. Is there an issue with capacity restraints though? Are there issues with labour costs, material costs? Like, because we're doing so much more, we're doing infrastructure, we're doing Olympics, we're doing high rise commercial towers. There's just only so much capacity we've got. And so if the government says, we want to go on a building boom and build lots of cheaper housing because it's not going to be the most premium stuff that they want to build, is there just going to be a real challenge to build that cost efficiently?
Look, there is a challenge. And there are capacity constraints. But if you look at housing supply over time in Australia, so new supply, in 2018, 2019, we built 215,000 dwellings. Now, this is not public dwellings, not social housing, but that was what we were delivering in that period. We're way below that now. So the capacity is not any different now in terms of the amount of labour or all the rest of it. Yes, there are different circumstances. We had COVID, we had construction costs go up. Yes, we've got big infrastructure spending, and that's drawing off labour, particularly labour that might be working in the high-rise sector or the high-density housing, less so the greenfield sort of housing, which is more subcontractors and tradies and so on. But I think that what I would say about the role government can play, government can be counter-cyclical. Like, we know that if you look at any graph of housing construction in Australia, residential construction in Australia, there's peaks and troughs. It goes up and down, booms and busts. You have an excess of supply and people stop building until that's soaked up, and then you start again. If you had the public sector playing a bigger role, it could smooth those troughs. When the private sector drops off, public sector ramps up, and vice versa. So you could actually smooth the construction, possibly keep people in employment rather than having them dropping out and back in, help keep some businesses afloat that we know. There's been a lot of builders go bust over the last couple of years. Maybe some of them could have been kept afloat if government was stepping in and saying, oh, well, we can build some more housing now. So it's not easy. I'm not pretending it's easy. And there are real challenges around constraints right at the moment. But we used to build more, and we are a much richer nation now than we were in the 50s or 60s.
Your book does call for a fundamental rethinking of housing as infrastructure, like roads or hospitals. Is that what you're talking about here, where the government needs to get back involved and treat it like infrastructure?
I think that's right. I mean,
what would that look like in practice?
Yeah, so let me take a step back on this and talk about why I think we should see housing as infrastructure, as essential as roads or water or any other kind of key infrastructure. So I think of it like this. We have a universal healthcare system, right? Everyone gets access to Medicare. Everyone can go to hospital. We know there's out-of-pocket. It's not perfect. There's out-of-pocket costs and all of this. But essentially, if you need healthcare, you should be able to get it. We know we have a universal education system. Every kid can go to school. You don't have to pay for it. Again, there's better and worse schools and all the rest of it. But basically, we have an idea that everyone gets health care, everyone gets education. But when it comes to housing, we don't do that. And to me, this is, if you think about a stool with three legs, and one leg is education, and one leg is healthcare, and the third leg is housing. Because if you don't have that third leg, the stool falls over. If you don't have, if children don't grow up with secure housing, their education is affected. They have to change schools all the time because their parents have to move, from their rental accommodation. Their health is affected because they're living somewhere that's damp and moldy, and they're, getting sick from the conditions. So, I think we need to see these three things: healthcare, education, and housing as three legs of this stool that create the stability that we need for a decent life. And that doesn't mean the state does everything. Doesn't mean the state builds all the housing, but it means that there's as with schooling and healthcare, there's a basis there, a foundation in place.
Well, I guess a metaphor in a way is that, you've got a public education system, you've also got a private education system, and they both coexist, and everyone has a right to education, and you can choose to whichever system you want to play in, I guess, and they all have
you can
access
afford
to university. And but it's still a choice. For some people it's a choice, but it's still an opportunity for everyone. And likewise with hospitals, there is a waiting list for non-elective surgery, or you can, if you can afford it, you can jump the queue and go on to the private system. I guess that's the way Singapore's housing sort of works, doesn't it? It's almost like you got that sort of public housing, private housing sort of setup, would you say?
Yeah, look, I'm not an expert on Singapore, but I mean, Singapore has very cleverly used its the equivalent of its superannuation system to fund housing and enable people to buy housing. And it's a remarkable achievement in Singapore. If you think about it, Singapore was a very poor island nation that went independent, and the first thing they did was concentrate on creating secure housing for everyone. And they've continued with that. And I think it is part of Singapore's recipe of success. There's lots of reasons you could criticize Singapore, sort of, you can't chew chewing gum and things like that. But basically, as a successful economy and stable society, housing has been, I think, fundamental to Singapore's success. And I think, the prospect we face in Australia is this growing inequality between those who have benefited from the bonanza, as I called it before, and those who are missing out. And their life, that's determining life chances. And that kind of inequality is not productive. Even from a kind of self-interested, well-running economy point of view, that's not good. We're losing productive capacity because people aren't getting well educated because, again, they don't have that secure housing, or they're ending up in jail, or they're on the streets, or whatever. So it's in all our interests to address this inequality in the housing system, I think.
Peter, do you think we have to sort of go back in time with what we aspire to as well? I mean, different generations grew up in different circumstances, and the homes that people wanted, say 50s and 60s and 70s, were a lot smaller. They were 1 bathroom, not 3 bathrooms, and 2 living areas, etc. And it's almost like the bigger's better. Do you think that as our country evolves, it's actually going back in time, and we get better at living in smaller spaces and stop holding on to the big block and the big house?
Look, I do think, I mean, that, we see it all the time, the call for addressing what's called the missing middle. And that missing middle term applies to 2 different ideas. One, what's missing is medium density development. So 3, 4 story medium density development, the kind that anyone who's been to a European city would be familiar with. That's one thing that's missing, and it's missing in the middle ring suburbs. So Australian cities, I mean, I live in Melbourne, and it's particularly obvious here, shooting up in the middle. So, high-rise residential right in the centre of the city, and out on the edges, a lot of, sprawling greenfield on the edges, but not so much happening in the middle ring post-World War II suburbs, where you still have the family home and so on. And so cracking that nut, we hear a lot about, well, we just have to reform planning, and we have to get the feds to kick the states, to kick the local governments so that they'll speed up planning reform and all the rest of it. And there's some truth in that. But also it's quite hard, because what you want to do is not just replace one family home with a duplex or 3 townhouses. Ideally, you want to amalgamate several blocks of land and then build something with an internal courtyard and trees and 2, 3, 4 stories that's well integrated, maybe has some shops underneath so that there's local place to go and get your milk. And, that's the ideal, but that's really hard to do. You need patient capital.
Yep.
You need help to amalgamate sites. I'm not surprised that, developing, I wouldn't want to be a property developer. It's a really tough job, right? And so we need ways to encourage high quality, really high quality development. We need to plan for climate change. We need to plan for an aging society where we need more smaller places with fewer bedrooms. Sorry, my phone's just going off here. I was sure I turned it off. Apologies for that. At the moment we've got, 4.3 million homes. That's 44% of Australian homes have 2 or more spare bedrooms. We've got a lot of space.
Wow.
We've got a lot of space. So 1.2 million homes have 3 or more spare bedrooms. So I think, going back to your question, Chris, or Veronica, it's true. We do need to kind of think about, well, if we want higher productivity, as we're talking about. We need higher productivity in residential construction. Well, maybe we should build more smaller houses and fewer big ones, because then we get more people in housing. But
It's sort of interesting though, because developers have to develop to make profit, right? They're not charities. And so when you had a bit of an investment boom, they were building, buildings with lots of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, but a lot of that was sold to overseas investors as well as local investors and also first home buyers. And of course, people wanting to have a family or whatever, it's well and good to say that they're going to buy one of those properties, but then they need more space. And then when they don't need space, what are you going to do? Go back to a 2-bedroom apartment where you came from? So it doesn't really work that way. And then you've also got situations where, and it's still happening, where you've got these massive areas of overdevelopment of that type of stock. And not majority, but a double figure percentages are selling at a loss. And the first time that these properties sell. So, earlier beginning, we opened up this conversation with you saying, well, it's not really a crisis for everyone. And you got a situation there where there are people who got onto the property ladder and then they need to upgrade or whatever they need to do. And they're having to sell at a loss. Otherwise they can't move on with their lives. So that's definitely a crisis for those people. It's still not talked about. I mean, the last Pain and Gain report from CoreLogic, which was chronicling the December quarter, there was something like 37% of apartments in Melbourne inner sold at a loss in that quarter, and in Sydney there was areas with 23%, 27%, so on. So you can build these and you can house more people, but they don't want to live in them, or they don't want to live in them in whatever location they're in, right? So we've got this real problem. And then I look at myself, I'm an empty nester now, right? I've got 2 spare bedrooms. If I didn't work from home, I'd have 3. So I'm one of those statistics, right? But I don't want to move from my house. So it's all this idea about the accommodation might be there, it might be appropriate, but people don't want to live in it or they don't want to move out of it. How do we crack that nut? Because that's the simple fact.
yeah, it's really interesting. And you raise great points, Veronica. And it's interesting because actually what we have is a system that's a private market system. And in theory, what that should deliver is what people want, right?
Yeah.
If it's a private market, it should be responding to consumer desires. And you're telling me it's not. It's built all these 1 and 2 bedroom apartments that actually people don't want to live in, and they're losing value and so on. And, that there's a, if we are going to, that's where I go back to this idea of the missing middle and the high quality, larger, mix of apartments. We need a mix of apartments, 1 and 2 and 3 bedroom apartments in not huge blocks, so you don't have massive body corporate fees or those kind of problems that are, or challenges in very large tower blocks and so on. And that's really, as I said, it's really hard to do. I mean, it's like the old joke, if you're going there, I wouldn't start from here. But we have to start from where we're at. So I do think that tax is really important here. And if I can tell just a little couple of stories about tax. In Britain, some centuries ago, they introduced a window tax.
Oh, yes.
The idea was that you tax because it was a sign of wealth, how many windows you had. Glass was expensive and so on. We know what happened, right? People bricked up their windows.
Yeah.
I lived in Vietnam, in Hanoi, for a couple of years. If anyone's been to Hanoi, in the old quarter there, they have these famous tube houses. And they're called tubes because they're really long and narrow. They've got really narrow frontages. Now, why are they long and narrow? Because tax was levied on the frontage. And so you built long, narrow houses rather than wide ones. So tax really does shape our behaviour in fundamental ways. And I would say one of the ways it shapes our behaviour in Australia is, what's your most tax-protected asset? It's your home, right? And so we're encouraged, and I don't mean encouraged consciously, but subconsciously. I mean, we're encouraged, well, where's the safest place to put your money? It's in your home. Add another bathroom, add another story, add another room. Hang on to it once you've got it, because yes, it's an asset that's been growing in value. And,
It's
you know,
it's actually very true, because even as you're saying that, I'm thinking about it's funny. I wanted to do an episode actually on all these distorting policies that distort housing, and those are two of the examples that are in my list of one of these days we might do an episode on. But I think about myself, for example. If I was to downsize right now, and I think about it every now and then, but then I think no. If I was to downsize right now, I would take some of the profit, if you want to call it that, from the sale of this house, because I'd be downsized. I wouldn't need everything.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, whatever I invest that in, I've got to pay tax on. Whereas the longer I stay here, I don't have to pay tax on it. So that's the type of behaviour you're talking about, right?
it's exactly that. And the other problem you'd face, of course, Veronica, if you downsize, and I should say we've downsized and we love it. We live in an apartment.
Good on you.
I never have to clean a gutter again, and that's a great thing, right?
That's a
and,
good
and
thing.
it gives me lots of time. I've got a gym and a pool upstairs. I've got lots of time to do the stuff I want to do, which is writing about housing a lot of the time. But so downsizing has a lot of pluses, and there are incentive schemes to whack some of that money into your superannuation as well if you downsize.
That's true.
So again, this is a scheme that benefits those who are wealthy enough to already have a
Yeah.
home that they can downsize from. But the other thing I was going to say, Veronica, is if you were considering downsizing, you'd face, well, I'm going to pay $50,000-$60,000 in stamp duty.
Stamp
right?
duty. Yep.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's kind of a pretty big disincentive. So if we shifted,
Another
again, coming
tax.
back to tax, if we shifted from stamp duty to a broad-based land tax, as they're doing in the ACT, broad-based property tax, then your incentives would shift. All of a sudden you'd be going, hang on, I'm paying land tax, property tax on my bedroom, on my 2 spare bedrooms that I don't need
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
I could do better to downsize and pay less property tax.
I might have some pressure. Yeah. I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. Most people don't realise that they can cost themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars over the medium to long term when they make property decisions without all of the information that they need. And what I do is help people with tricky real estate problems, which often masquerade as simple questions like, should I sell my investment property because the interest repayments are hurting? Or should I buy before I sell? Or the other way around. You can connect with me and access all of the tools that I've created to help you make better property decisions at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you will find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program. You can connect with my Sydney-based property management and buyer's agency teams, Australia-wide vendor advocacy, or ask me for introduction to the small group of buyer's agents that I would personally recommend across the country. That's veronicamorgan.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading to a new one, or purchasing investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and, importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via my website, ourcove.com.au.
Now, actually, you recently wrote that, because this sort of leads us into what else we want to talk about, and you recently wrote the Treasury is quietly equipping itself to take housing policy more seriously, and that's obviously, this is in that wheelhouse, right? What do you think is changing behind the scenes, and why now?
Yeah, look, this is really interesting. I mean, I think, we've had Claire O'Neill as a minister now for a couple of years, she came over from Home Affairs. And personally, I'm pleased she stayed on as minister. We didn't have yet another reshuffle, so she's housing minister. But, there's no housing department at the national level, right? So she sits in Treasury. She's a minister under the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. And housing has been scattered across lots of different portfolios. So homelessness and renting was in Social Security, for example. The construction industry was in the Department of Industry. What else is there? There was no one at the federal level had any responsibility for planning and building because they're state matters. And a city's policy was with infrastructure. Now, what's happened is all of those areas, so housing, homelessness, renting, homelessness, the construction industry, cities policy, they're now all under Claire O'Neill in Treasury. So I don't know exactly what she's going to do with that, or what she and the Treasurer are going to do with that, but it means they've got all the levers in one, or more of the levers in one place. which should enable a more coherent approach to housing policy at the national level than we've seen in the past. And I would say Labor has had a more coherent approach in the last few years as well. It's been much more focused on housing than perhaps was the view under the coalition, which regarded housing as a state matter and was a bit more hands-off. And that remains a huge issue because the states also have a big role to play and we need a high level of coordination, federal, state and local level.
Peter, obviously the election's done and dusted, and they're trying to put a super policy through at the moment. And I mean, you've just highlighted, change the incentive, change the behaviour, the little windows to the small frontages. Do you think the labour market really have thought through, though, the unintended consequences of if you really disincentivise super as the vehicle for saving for your retirement and holding wealth in? Do people just go, like you say, to that tax-free asset and their home, and they just funnel their money more and more into just paying off their home, getting a big tax-free asset growing? I can downsize from that from my retirement. There's no point putting in more money into super. It's only going to there's a cap on that. There's unrealized gain tax now. So I might not even buy other investments because they might even put them on my properties, but they might not do it on the sacramental, the land, which is your house, right? That it's very unlikely that's ever going to be the case. So do you think it just forces people to go, I'm just going to bet on my house, and I know that it's the thing that they're never going to touch?
Well, I guess it could do, Chris, but I think by the time you've got 3 million in super, you've probably got a pretty good house as well. You've probably already got a great house, and I doubt, there's not many people who have that sort of super. And I guess, I mean, I'm not an expert on super by any means, but what the government is saying here, or what particularly the Grattan Institute has been arguing this, superannuation was set up. We get a lot of tax benefits from super, as in, we get very lightly taxed on the way in. We don't pay any tax on the way out once we're in the retirement phase. And it was meant to be a replacement for the pension, essentially, a retirement income. It's not meant to be a nest egg to pass on to your kids. And so they're looking to disincentivize that. But you could say the same thing about housing. Maybe we should be disincentivizing putting all that money into the house, in the sense that this is what I'm going to hand on to my kids. Another example of tax policy, I could have, it doesn't really matter what my house is worth if I want to get the pension. It's not part of the assets test, and which seems odd. Like if I've got a really, really big house, maybe I shouldn't get a pension as well. I mean, probably, again, most people in that situation will have enough super too, so they won't be on the pension. But it's the kind of treating the housing in this way, the capital gains tax discount, the complete exemption of any tax on the primary residence encourages this overinvestment, and then we get the bigger houses rather than maybe housing more appropriate to a population with smaller families and fewer kids and more people living alone and all the rest of it.
Peter, I think they're going to give money to the kids, though. I think there's this attitude that I can't leave my money in super, because it's a really hard. I'm not saying it's not a bad policy at all. I'm not saying, and it absolutely, there's a lot of money with money in super, but you change the incentive, you'll change behavior, right? So they'll either upgrade their home, I feel, they might put it into trusts and things like that, or they'll give it to kids. People can be like, well, I'd rather give it to my kids so then they can put it into a tax-free asset. And so I think a lot of that money will potentially find its way back into just residential property. And I think that's one of the things that they just won't, factor in. I think, this election, they might get this through, but do you think they're just scared of making those other big changes? They went, because they tried a few times at different elections and they lost because they went for the negative year and they went for the capital gains tax. Or do you feel like, just due to the size of their win, they're pretty confident going to the next election with some, more aggressive policies? I mean, what's your take?
My take is they're not confident. And I mean, whether they lost in 2016 and 2019 because of negative gearing and changes to capital gains tax, I'm not so sure. They lost both those elections. I mean, it's quite funny, really. In 2016, they nearly won, to everyone's surprise. And in 2019, they got basically the same result and just lost. to everyone's surprise again. So
Surprise.
there are lots
Yep.
of factors, of course, in there. And I agree, there's been a very strong campaign about negative gearing. I would say, though, that I think we have to take back a step, and we have to say to all the people who are criticising the superannuation tax, or who say you can't go there on capital gains tax changes or whatever, we have to say, well, hang on a minute. We're spending $356 billion on submarines. We've got the NDIS growing. We've got more and more people needing healthcare, aged care. We need to make the energy transition. So we need to build more rail lines and get people out of their cars. So this all, we're expecting a lot of government. And so government has to pay for it. So the question is, where does that come from? Where does that revenue come from? And you're right, Chris. I think a lot of the people who might be up for this new superannuation tax will move it into trusts or whatever.
Yeah.
But the question is, well, then how are we going to pay for this if it's not the wealthiest Australians contributing a bit more? They're the if wealthier Australians, who are the ones who can afford it. I mean, look at me. I'm a late baby boomer, right? So I'm just in the baby boomer rather than Gen X, and I've had all the benefits. I could buy a house when it was affordable. I got free university education. I joined superannuation very early. This is all luck. Now, I should be expected to share some of my luck with other people. I've made money out of property. Yeah, I've been careful. I've made good decisions, but a lot of it is luck and timing, being born in a certain time rather than another one. There's no reason why, say, my son should get all of that, I don't think. There's no reason why when there are other people who haven't had the luck I've had, that generational luck, that it should be shared around a bit more. And I'd like to see people who oppose all these propositions like capital gains tax adjustments or whatever. Well, how do you want to pay for the submarines and the NDIS and the aged care and the infrastructure and all the rest of it?
I think it is very important that, we do have tax reform. Obviously, I don't think anyone's going to argue that we don't need it, right? It's just how. But this superannuation policy.
And if I can go to that, how, Veronica, I think the how is not capital gains tax changes because of housing. The how is we need to look holistically at our tax system, and capital gains tax, which doesn't just apply to housing, it applies to all sorts of investment. That needs to be on the table. It needs to be part of the discussion. We need to say, why do I tax someone's windfall gains from a share investment so much more lightly than I tax the guy picking up the rubbish, getting up at 3 a.m. to empty the bins, who's paying a higher rate of tax on his earnings than someone who got in early on a share float and made a killing.
I think that it's an interesting discussion we've been having around this superannuation tax, though, because it's looking at it more as less as, the ultra wealthy should be taxed more, which I don't disagree with. I actually do not disagree with that at all. It's sort of the mechanics of it. It's interesting that they haven't indexed it, for example. So that's going to be over time. That it's one of the problems with stamp duty in New South Wales, for example. It wasn't indexed properly, and even land tax, right? So if these aren't designed well in the first place with that sort of consideration of the future, and you could potentially, if you index it, you potentially do it with a lower balance. Like it's there's so many different ways this could be put together.
Yeah. I think there's an argument for indexing on a lower balance, but the point we don't index income tax either. That's why we get bracket creep, and every now and again the government adjusts the brackets, and so you'd expect the same thing with a tax on superannuation. But I think I think there are arguments around the taxing unrealised gains, and maybe there's a smarter way to do it, and let's hope the Parliament comes up with a smarter way to do it. But again, the overall question is, okay, we need to raise more revenue to do all the things we want to do. How are we going to do that? Let's get together and sort of put down our weapons and, sort of stop being in our entrenched positions and saying, no way this, no way that. Actually, we have to put stuff on the table and have an honest debate about looking down the track of an aging society, climate change, and housing, and the need
And
to
increase government debt.
rebalance our housing system and increasing government debt.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. We need to do something, and I hope that's going to be a debate in the next 3 years.
So you're hopeful.
I'm hopeful.
You're hopeful, and you think that this rearrangement in Treasury perhaps might be a harbinger of good. Maybe.
Well, I think less that than it's saying that now we've got a group of people in Treasury who are all focused on housing and focused on the different bits of it. So productivity in the construction industry, land policy, what's happening in the National Housing Accord with the states, homelessness. This is all in one place. And so the links between different parts of the system are hopefully going to be better coordinated than we've seen in the past. That's my hope. But I hope too that they'll, the government will say, get business and unions and the opposition and minor parties and the Teals and everyone around a table to say, well, let's put our ideas forward. Let's open it up. And certainly some of the Teal MPs have been saying that for several years now. We need to actually start having this debate and, as I say, lay down our weapons for a while and sort of have an honest conversation about where we're going.
Peter, you mentioned around land tax. It's a funny one, right? So when Paratet in New South Wales tried it for first-time buyers up to 1.5 million, it was like, well, finally someone's brave enough to give this a crack, and it makes sense, right? But very quickly, the stamp duty savings were factored into price growth. Properties that should have sold at 1.2 were selling at 1.35, 1.35 went straight to 1.5 on the dollar. And you know that because there was an amount of properties that sold for $1.5 million on the dollar. Because that's where the stamp duty exemption finished. And I guess, and firstly, the government's got to pay for that. It's the coffers they get from stamp duty, what is it, 30-40%, depending on the state, of their tax revenue is from that. And it's really hard to replace that. And so a broad-based land tax, it makes so much sense, right? People will move and they won't stay in their properties as much, but it'll also create these transactions. The person in the smaller house who wants a bigger house will be like, well, I don't mind taking on more debt because I need a bigger house, and I don't have to pay a lot of money in stamp duty. So do you think that it'll be, a smooth transition where it actually keeps prices more affordable? Or do you think that potentially it could do the opposite where, people are moving and maybe they're moving into houses that better suit them, but often when they do that, they'll take out more debt and prices will go up anyway?
Yeah, look, I think the key question, Chris, is the transition, is how you get from here to there. Because, of course, if you ask me to start paying a property tax on my property now, I'd say, but I paid stamp duty already, right? So you've got to,
exactly.
and the ACT is doing it over 20 years. So, and I can see the problem that in the short term, there you've got more borrowing capacity, so you'll pay more for the house and you'll have an initial bump in house prices. But once you get over the transition, I don't think the benefit is in lower house prices from switching from stamp duty to a broad-based property tax. I think the benefit is in much more efficient use of housing. So I think the benefit is in then encouraging right-sizing, encouraging people to move out of big homes and into smaller ones because they'll reduce their tax, their property tax obligations, and encouraging people, productivity benefits, encouraging people to move interstate or across town to take up that better paid job where they're going to help boost that particular industry, because the transaction costs of moving are not as high. You're not going to take up the new job if it's going to cost you $60,000, $70,000 in stamp duty. And for the states, I agree, the states are addicted to stamp duty, but actually they'd be better off with a broad-based property tax because their income would be reliable year on year. What happens with stamp duty is when real estate stops selling, as you both know it does every now and again, when people are holding off buying and they're holding off selling,
Yeah, for sure.
then stamp duty dries up, and all of a sudden,
Yeah.
there's billions of dollars
Revenues
not
hit the
coming.
wall.
Revenues hit the wall. So if you had a broad-based property tax, that would be a steady, more predictable flow of income for the state. So the problems are all in the transition, and the Commonwealth could play a role here. So you might remember a few decades ago now, I think they were what were they called, the Hilmer competition reforms, where the Commonwealth paid the states money to get them to take away certain taxes that were seen as holding back investment or holding back economic activity. So the government the federal government, which has much better borrowing capacity, could bridge the gap for the states to help them make the transition. As you had a kind of a slow transition as people move houses, they stop paying stamp duty and they start paying property tax instead. But it's not easy, and it's a state-based thing. It has to be done in every different state. It's not something the federal government can just legislate or anything like that because of constitutional issues. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard, but things being hard aren't reasons not to do them, right? John Howard brought in the GST. That was really tough. He nearly lost an election, but he showed it was possible if you argue the case. And, arguably, we're better off as a result.
It's probably the last government that did do anything hard when you think about it. So I'm actually curious, Peter, given your background in media, what has spurred this interest in housing?
Well, I guess the sort of journalism I've always been interested in is I'm a bit of a policy wonky type of journalist. I'm interested in policy issues. And so it's been, it's really that intersection between the human story, people's lives, and government's attempts to kind of craft policies that work. And there's always a gap, right? I mean, you have an aspiration, this policy's going to do X, Y, and Z, and then there are unintended consequences. And so I'm really interested in both the personal story and the big, not the politics so much as the policy picture. How can we make this work better? And I spent a couple of years at the Grattan Institute working on their cities program. That also got me very interested in housing. But really, I see it as a fundamental issue of both economic efficiency. If we want an efficient, good economy, we've got to get housing right, and social justice. If we want a society where we talk about it, actually believe in a fair go, believe in people having a chance, then we've got to make sure they have decent housing that they can afford, because otherwise their lives are not going to flourish, not going to have good lives.
I mean, you were at the ABC for a long time. I mean, what was your they're reporting at the moment, it does get a little bit on the I guess the height of the. What was your thoughts on? I guess
feels
media.
naive.
Media's reporting on the property market and the quality of the journalism that we have in Australia.
Oh, look, I don't want to cast aspersions on my fellow journalists, but I think, as I said earlier on, there is this kind of real split. On the one hand, you'll have a story about homelessness and how terrible things are, and then you'll have another story about how fantastic the auction results were on the weekend, or this, multi-million-dollar sports players mansion with the 3 swimming pools, how much it went for, or something like that. And I think we also have to be honest about the role that property plays as an advertiser. I mean, Domain is a really significant part of Nine, and realestate.com is a really significant part of the Murdoch empire. These are very important drivers of revenue. So that influences then, I think Cameron Cusher might have talked about this on your program a while ago. But I think there's been some really great reporting too about, I just watched actually before we started this conversation, I was watching, someone sent me a link to a story from Channel 10 in Sydney about 2 women in their 70s, 2 nurses, retired nurses, one of them, using a walker and stuff, being kicked out of their rental property in the rain, And so that was a really compelling report, and we need to hear these stories. There's been a lot of great reporting on what's been going on up in around Brisbane with people being, rough camping and being moved on. These are really hard, difficult issues. It's, people don't want rough sleepers on their doorsteps. And so if we don't want that, it's not good enough just to move them on, right? We've got to create more support services. And in the end, we need more affordable housing. That's what it comes back to always, more housing that people can afford. We've got a lot of housing that's not being very well utilised. So I think we could do a better job of using the housing we've got to make the system fairer.
Peter, have you got a property dumbo for us? Not sure if you've...
segue perfectly.
I'm familiar with the program and the dumbos. I've got a few, but let me start with one of my own.
Okay, we can do a few.
In the 90s, my wife and I bought an apartment in Brisbane, and it seemed like a great deal at the time. Interest rates were high then, but negative gearing meant quite a good tax break. And I hadn't really thought about housing or negative gearing at that stage. And this apartment was part of a hotel, so we had a guaranteed 8% return for the first 2 years, and then it would be renegotiated. And we thought this is great,
Yeah.
Well, after the 2 years, the renegotiation, the terms weren't quite so good. But what's more important is that when we decided we wanted to sell this property, its value had gone down. And the reason its value had gone down is because they built another tower right next door and another tower right next door to that. So you could buy a brand new one with a better view. Now, that's one of the things, so we didn't really think about that unit prices, apartment prices don't grow in the same way that freestanding houses grow because, as I'm sure your listeners know, it's not the value of the house that's going up, it's the value of the land. Houses actually deteriorate. They need fixing up, they need work, they need investment and so on. And, this raises actually a bigger issue, which we've been talking about, which is that if we're going to really address our housing crisis, we have to accept that house prices won't keep going up. And if more people live in apartments, they're not going to make that capital gain on owning an apartment that they might have made previously on a freestanding house. So we do need to shift to that idea that housing is something you live in to have a home and a good place to live, not something that you use to store your wealth in. And that's a big kind of shift. But, the reality is if we want to make the housing situation better, we've got to stop house prices going up, right? We've got to stop them going up.
It's sort of, my argument there would be, well, then rent a property like that, don't buy it. And it's fine that prices, you're not trapped in there and your equity isn't, or your investment isn't trapped into that. And it's not just about land value though there. It is also about scarcity because that's all about the fact that, you can build lots of others that are just like it. So some apartments do very well in capital growth because they are in small boutique buildings or they're, warehouse conversions or Art Deco or just in even red brick 3-story walk-ups and do very well if they're in a suburb where there's not lots and lots of development. But so,
or if they're in Bondi and close to the beach, right? Yeah, there's location matters as well. No, absolutely true.
Yeah. But it's a really good thing because a lot of people don't think about that, and that's the scary thing for first home buyers. If nothing went up and you just the entire market was static and you bought your 2-bedroom apartment that you outgrew when you had a child, and then when you go to buy the 3-bedder, it doesn't matter because they haven't gone up either. Then it's all good. Because it all stays within reach. But the problem is when people buy an asset that doesn't go up or goes backwards and then they want to upgrade, they need to upgrade into something that is scarce, that has gone up in value and that gap widens. And that's the scary thing about this whole issue about, yes, we need more supply, we need more properties. And then I've got my other hat on, which is Home Buyer Academy. We've got a course for first home buyers. We teach them the process of buying a property and we're saying to them, please don't go and buy brand new. I know that governments are incentivizing you to go buy brand new, and it makes perfect sense from a policy point of view to incentivize you and give you free money to go and buy brand new, but you don't want to own that if you've got this high probability of losing money. So it's complicated, isn't it?
It is complicated, and I guess my overall point is that we need And look, the worst thing in the world would be a property price crash, right? I'm not wishing that on anyone because that would bring on a big recession and threaten our financial system. Very high rates of mortgage debt in the Australian banking system. So I'm not arguing for that, certainly, but we do need to stop this constant escalation of house prices in relation to wages. And that means some of us might have to accept, well, I live in a property that hasn't increased in value, but I have a good life. I've got a good home. That's what is important. That I have a place to live that suits my needs. So, I do think it's really tricky, but we do need to get away from this idea that property is an asset that will always grow, and need to accept that actually the price of housing should stabilise or even trend slightly down so it's more affordable for more people.
Our problem is that we have demand, and that's going to put paid to that. And then you've got a situation too, if we have that sort of siloed markets where you've got properties that will stay the same or trend downwards, you've still got that scarce asset. There's going to be that gulf will widen between the good stuff and the stock standard stuff. So I'm not sure that solves the problem personally, but I hear what you're saying. What's your other dumbos? Because you said you had a few.
Well, let's see. The other dumbo was actually a bit of reporting I saw recently, which was a story saying, this is where you could buy an apartment more cheaply than paying rent. And they did the calculations saying, that the mortgage repayments would be this, and that would be lower than your rent if you bought in this or that suburb. And what they didn't say is that you'd also have body corporate fees.
Yeah.
Body corporate fees can be significant, right? So it was kind of a very misleading article, I thought, to not say actually, well, if you're buying into a unit, particularly if it's in a larger kind of building, well, you've got to factor in the body corporate fees along with the mortgage payments, because that can be a significant addition. And I just thought that's dumb reporting, to give the impression that, oh, well, you don't have to rent anymore because you can just buy a unit for the same amount of outlay each week. It's not true, all right?
Yeah.
So that
was that one.
Exactly.
Another clickbait of the media world, which we won't go there. But thank you, Peter. That's a great chat. I really, really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for coming on. And you've got a lot of wisdom in your brain. So thank you.
Yeah, and I will say we'll put in the link in the show notes to some of your stories that you write for Inside Story. So for some of your pieces that you write there that you've mentioned, you contribute pro bono for. And look, there is they are looking for donations and to support the work that they're doing. So we're going to put the link in the show notes. Now, this is an end of financial year donation drive, and I'm not sure we'll go live before the end of the financial year. So apologies there. If you do donate, you'll just have to wait a full 12 months before you put in your tax return.
Yeah, it is reader-supported journalism, and it's a great publication, not just for housing. So, yeah, people can... but if you can't afford to help it out, then just read it instead.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.